Does the Constitution allow the federal government to establish a bank even if it's not expressly stated in the Constitution? To find out, you have to read McCullogh versus Maryland, but it's 22 pages. Don't have time for that? I've got you covered. Let's dive into the details of this landmark case. This is TLDR, where I cover New York Court of Appeals cases in 5 minutes or less. But this is part of a special series I'm doing on landmark cases. Today, we're diving into McCullogh versus Maryland, cited as 17 U.S. 316. This case was published by the United States Supreme Court on March 6, 1819. Central to this case is a pivotal question. What are the implied powers of Congress? Now let's understand the background law that helps us understand this case. Before we dive into the facts of the case, it's crucial to understand the background law. Our Constitution has two key clauses that set the stage for McCullogh versus Maryland. First up is the Necessary and Proper Clause, also known as the Elastic Clause. This clause gives Congress the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution its powers. In other words, it allows Congress to pass laws needed to carry out its expressed powers. Next, we have the Supremacy Clause. This clause establishes the U.S. Constitution, federal statutes, and treaties as the supreme law of the land. It essentially means that federal law takes precedence over state laws, and when there's a conflict, federal law wins. These two clauses form the backbone of our constitutional framework and play a pivotal role in McCullogh versus Maryland. With this background, let's look at the facts of the case. The year was 1819, and the United States was still a young nation. The Second Bank of the United States had been established by Congress just 5 years earlier, in 1814. This bank was a federal institution, and it had branches in several states, including Maryland. Maryland, however, wasn't pleased with this arrangement. They saw the bank as an intrusion on their state's sovereignty. It represented a competitor in the marketplace against Maryland state lending institutions. So, in an attempt to drive the bank out of their state, Maryland decided to impose a hefty tax on all banks not chartered by the state. The Second Bank of the United States, being a federal entity, did not have a state charter, so it would be required by the Maryland law to pay this new tax, or would be in violation of the Maryland law. The Maryland branch of the federal bank, managed by James McCullogh, refused to pay the tax. McCullogh argued for the federal bank that the tax was unconstitutional, claiming that states cannot tax federal institutions. This led to a legal battle that would end up in the Supreme Court. Let's look at how this case made its way to the Supreme Court. McCullogh versus Maryland began in the State Court of Maryland, where the state court ruled in favor of its own right to tax the national bank. Unhappy with this decision, the bank's officer, James McCullogh, appealed to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court agreed to hear the case, taking up the question of whether a state has the power to tax a federal entity. Now let's examine the Supreme Court's decision. The court, led by Chief Justice John Marshall, ruled in favor of the federal bank, setting a precedent that bolstered the power of the federal government. Marshall interpreted the Necessary and Proper Clause of the Constitution in a broad sense, asserting that Congress has implied powers beyond those explicitly listed. This interpretation allowed for the creation and operation of a federal bank. While this was not a power explicitly granted in the Constitution, it was deemed by the Supreme Court to be necessary and proper for carrying out its enumerated powers. In addition, the Supremacy Clause was invoked to establish that state laws cannot interfere with federal laws. This was a principle that would guide the country through many future conflicts between state and federal authority. However, Justice William Johnson offered a dissenting opinion, arguing for a narrower interpretation of federal power. This dissent would fuel debates about states' rights and federalism for years to come. Let's explore the impact of this decision. The impact of McCullogh versus Maryland on American law and government cannot be overstated. This case had a profound influence on the interpretation of the U.S. Constitution. It cemented the federal government's authority over the states, emphasizing that when federal and state law conflict, federal law prevails. Additionally, McCullogh versus Maryland broadened the understanding of the necessary and proper clause, allowing the federal government to take actions not explicitly outlined in the Constitution as long as they are in furtherance of its express powers. This has expanded the scope of federal authority, defining the balance of power in the United States. And that's McCullogh versus Maryland in a nutshell. If you like what you just saw and want to see more just like it, please hit like or subscribe to let me know.